Amid the gleaming marble and the blur of suits, something terrible went unnoticed. A subtle exchange of documents concealed a meticulously planned scheme. The only witness was too small to be heard, and it was her warning that prevented an entire corporation from collapsing. If this incredible story of love and resilience has you hooked, make sure to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Here's what happened. Carmen Hayes woke up at 3 in the morning with her heart pounding, not from an alarm clock, but from the anxiety that had been eating away at her for weeks. In the tiny studio apartment in the Bronx, she watched Isabella, her 5-year-old daughter, sleeping peacefully on the worn mattress they shared. The child breathed softly, oblivious to the problems tormenting her mother, her small arms wrapped around a patched-up teddy bear Carmen had bought for $2 at a thrift store. At 38, Carmen carried the weight of supporting her daughter alone ever since Robert, the girl's father, had abandoned them 2 years earlier without explanation, taking their meager savings with him. Her days began before dawn and ended after midnight, a grueling routine that included 3 different jobs: a janitor at the Vance Enterprises corporate building during the day, a cashier at a small bodega in the East Village in the afternoon, and pressing clothes at night for a neighborhood dry cleaners. Even with this inhuman schedule, the money barely covered the $900 rent, basic utilities, and the simple food that kept them alive. Carmen got up silently, stepping on the loose floorboards. She went to the small window overlooking the building's inner courtyard, where clothes hanging on lines created a colorful labyrinth of urban survival. That morning, however, Carmen faced a crisis that threatened her already precarious stability. Mrs. Nelson, the 76-year-old neighbor who watched Isabella while she worked, had been rushed to the hospital the night before. No warning, no alternative, no one to turn to. The nearly empty refrigerator and her empty pockets were a constant reminder that Carmen couldn't afford to miss a day of work. The phone rang insistently, shattering the heavy silence of the early morning. It was Mark Miller, the cleaning supervisor at her building, a 45-year-old man known for his strictness and lack of patience with employees' personal problems. "Carmen, are you coming in today or not? We have that huge meeting with the Russian investors. The building needs to be spotless. If you're a no-show, you'll have to find another job, and you know how hard it is to find work out there." Carmen felt her stomach churn, and her hands began to tremble. She knew how important that day was for the company. For weeks, she had overheard executives talking about the meeting that would define the company's future, an international deal worth $2.3 billion. The entire 30th floor had been reorganized specifically to receive the foreign investors, with new furniture, luxurious decor, and state-of-the-art equipment installed just to impress them. "Mark, I have a serious problem at home. The person who watches my daughter is in the hospital, and I have no one to leave Isabella with. You know I never miss a day, that I always do my best." "That's your problem, Carmen. The company can't stop because you have domestic issues. Either you come in, or I'll find someone else to take your place, and I guarantee you there's a line of people who want this job." The call ended abruptly, leaving Carmen with the phone in her hand and tears in her eyes. She looked at Isabella, who was starting to stir on the mattress, her curly brown hair spread across the thin pillow. The girl had her mother's expressive dark eyes and a precocious intelligence that always impressed the adults around her. Since she was little, Isabella had shown a remarkable ability to observe, noticing details that even adults missed, like shifts in people's moods or objects out of place. Carmen sat on the edge of the mattress, watching her daughter's serene face. Isabella was everything she had in the world, the only reason she kept fighting every single day. The girl had never complained about their difficult life, never asked for expensive toys or brand-name clothes like the other kids at school. She seemed to understand instinctively that her mother was doing the best she could. The decision Carmen made in that moment was a desperate one, but it seemed like the only option. She picked up the phone again and called Mark, her hands shaking as she dialed. "Mark, can I bring my daughter with me? She'll be quiet, she won't bother anyone. Please, I really need this job. It's all I have." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, during which Carmen could hear her own heart beating. "Carmen, have you lost your mind? A kid can't be wandering around the building, especially on a day like today. The executives get nervous about anything out of the ordinary, and today we'll have important people from all over the world. She won't wander, Mark. I'll put her in a little chair in a discreet corner, and she'll stay there the whole time. I promise no one will even notice she's there. Isabella is very obedient. She's never any trouble. Mark sighed heavily, clearly annoyed with the situation. If anyone complains, you're out on the spot, and the kid stays invisible. You got it? I don't want to see her or even know she exists. One peep, one problem, and you're both on the street. Carmen thanked him, tears of relief and desperation in her eyes. She gently woke Isabella, stroking her hair as the girl opened her big, curious eyes. Honey, Mommy, I need to take you to work with her today. You're going to have to be very, very quiet, no noise, and don't move from where I put you. Can you do that for me? Isabella, still sleepy, but sensing the worry in her mother's voice, nodded seriously. I can, Mommy. I'll be quiet as a mouse. Carmen helped Isabella get dressed in the best dress she owned, a simple but clean hand-me-down from a former employer. She packed a small backpack with a few children's books, colored pencils, and a simple snack, crackers and a banana, and also put in a small water bottle. The trip to downtown Manhattan was an ordeal. 2 hours on a crowded city bus, with Isabella on Carmen's lap, among workers irritated by the traffic. Carmen carried her bag of cleaning supplies and held Isabella tightly, trying to shield her from the constant jostling. During the ride, Carmen repeated the instructions to her daughter several times. Remember what Mommy always teaches you, Isabella. Always tell the truth, even when it's scary. That's right, my love, but today you need to be invisible, like a friendly little ghost that no one can see. Promise. Isabella nodded seriously, understanding the gravity of the situation better than many children her age. The Vance Enterprises building rose imposingly in the financial district, its 45 stories of mirrored glass reflecting the grey morning sky. The structure was intimidating even for adults, and Isabella looked up with wide eyes, trying to see the top that was lost among the low clouds. Carmen showed her employee ID at the front desk and passed through the metal detectors, carrying Isabella in her arms to speed up the process. The security guards watched her with poorly disguised curiosity, clearly questioning the presence of a child, but said nothing after verifying she was with a registered employee. In the service elevator, they rode up to the 30th floor. The hallways were different that day, bustling with well-dressed executives, security guards, and technicians adjusting equipment for the meeting. Carmen found a small chair in a secondary corridor near the meeting rooms, in a spot that offered relative discretion. Stay right here, honey. Don't leave this chair for any reason, you hear me? If anyone asks you anything, you tell them you're waiting for Mommy to get off work. Isabella sat obediently in the chair, her short legs dangling, in the air without touching the floor. Carmen carefully arranged the books and snack around the girl, creating a small fortress of entertainment that needed to last the entire day. As Carmen began her strenuous work, meticulously cleaning the rooms that would be used for the most important meetings in the company's history, Isabella watched the fascinating activity around her. It was a world completely different from the one she knew in her life in the Bronx. People dressed in clothes that cost more than her mother earned in months hurried through the gleaming corridors, talking on expensive phones or carrying genuine leather briefcases. The girl quickly developed a mental game, trying to understand people just by observing their gestures, facial expressions, and the way they moved. It was a skill her mother always admired. Around 10 in the morning, the special guests arrived. Isabella saw a group of men in dark suits being escorted through the hallways. They spoke in a different language and had thick accents when they tried to speak English. One of the company's executives greeted them with exaggerated reverence. Carmen passed quickly through the corridor where Isabella was, checking to see if everything was okay. The girl gave a discreet wave and returned her attention to the movement around her. It was then that Isabella witnessed something that made her small heart start to race. Isabella watched in silence as the two men opened the briefcase with precise, nervous movements. Her small hands tightened on the book she was reading, and she instinctively shrank into the chair, trying to become even more invisible. The men didn't notice her, too focused on their mysterious task. The first man, a fellow with a greying moustache and gold-rimmed glasses, took out a stack of white papers from the briefcase. Isabella could see they were sheets with lots of numbers and letters printed on them, looking like important documents. He folded them quickly and tucked them inside his suit jacket. Then he took other sheets from a bag he was carrying. These were yellowish and looked completely different from the first ones. The second man, younger and visibly anxious, stood guard in the hallway while his partner worked. Isabella noticed how his hands trembled slightly and how his eyes darted around as if he expected to be caught at any moment. The girl knew she was witnessing something wrong. Even at 5 years old, her child's intuition picked up on the vibes of guilt and haste emanating from the two men. The way they moved, looked around and whispered to each other, reminded her of the time she had seen older kids getting into mischief at the neighborhood playground. When they finished the swap, the men closed the briefcase and walked away quickly, heading in opposite directions as if they had never met. Isabella was left alone in the hallway, her heart pounding in her small chest. She looked around for her mother, but Carmen was in a distant room, carrying out her cleaning duties. The girl began to struggle internally. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Always tell the truth, even when it's scary. But along with that lesson came the fear of the consequences. What if no one believed her? What if the adults got angry? What if she caused trouble for her mom and Carmen lost her job? 15 minutes passed in silent agony. Isabella tried to turn her attention back to her book, but the words seemed to dance on the page without making sense. Her mind was completely occupied with what she had witnessed. She knew, even without fully understanding, that those papers were important for the meeting everyone was preparing for so carefully. The activity in the hallway intensified. Executives rushed past, carrying laptops and talking on their phones. Isabella overheard snippets of conversations mentioning the Russians, final documents, and a historic signing. The tension in the air was palpable, even for a child. It was then that Isabella saw the briefcase again. The same man with the greying mustache reappeared, now accompanied by other company executives and the foreign visitors. He carried the briefcase with the red stripe as if it were a treasure, treating it with exaggerated reverence. The other men around him nodded and smiled, clearly impressed with the international documentation he was presenting. Isabella watched the group head toward the main conference room. Her stomach ached with nervousness. She knew something terrible was about to happen, but she felt small and powerless in a world of adults who would never listen to her. Just then, Carmen appeared in the hallway, pushing a cleaning cart. She quickly checked to see if Isabella was okay and whispered, "How's my princess doing? Is everything okay over here?" Isabella looked at her mother's tired face and hesitated. Part of her wanted to tell her everything, but another part feared the consequences. Carmen was already stressed enough, worried about keeping her job and supporting them both. The girl didn't want to add more problems to her mother's already difficult life. "Everything's fine, Mommy," Isabella murmured, looking down. Carmen smiled and quickly kissed her daughter's forehead before continuing her work. Isabella watched her walk away and felt a weight in her chest. She had just chosen silence, going against the most important lesson she had ever been taught. 20 minutes later, a commotion began to build near the conference room. Isabella saw executives rushing in and out, talking on their phones with tense expressions. Someone mentioned problems with the documentation, unexpected delays, and the need to sort everything out before it's too late. It was at that moment that Isabella saw him for the first time, Edward Vance, the company's president. At 52, he was an imposing man, wearing an impeccable navy blue suit and carrying himself with a posture that radiated power and authority. His greying hair was perfectly styled, and he walked down the hall with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, without question. Edward was talking intensely with his aides, gesturing firmly as he discussed the final details of the meeting. Isabella could hear fragments of his deep, decisive voice. "We need to close this today. The investors are getting impatient. We can't lose this opportunity." The girl watched as everyone around him moved with nervous haste, anxious to meet his expectations. Edward Vance was clearly the center of it all, the man who made the decisions that affected hundreds of employees and billions of dollars. As he walked toward the conference room, Edward slowed his pace as he passed the corridor where Isabella was sitting. For a brief moment their eyes met. The girl saw surprise on his face, surprise at finding a child in such a controlled corporate environment. But it was more than surprise. Edward noticed something in Isabella's gaze, a tension, an urgency that shouldn't exist on the face of a 5-year-old child. His business instincts, honed by decades of negotiations and crises, picked up a warning signal. Isabella felt as if time had stopped. There was the most powerful man in that place looking directly at her. Her child's mind wrestled with fear and responsibility. Her mother's words echoed louder. Always tell the truth even when it's scary. Isabella's heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone in the hallway could hear it. Edward Vance had stopped completely, ignoring the aides who were calling him, and kept his gaze fixed on the girl. There was something in his eyes, not impatience or irritation, but genuine curiosity. Isabella made a decision that would change everything. In a trembling, almost inaudible voice, she called out, "Mister!" Edward approached, bending down slightly to be at her level. "What is it, little one?" Isabella took a deep breath, gathering all the courage her mother had taught her to have, and whispered the words that would make the world of those adults come crashing down. "I saw them switch the papers in the red briefcase." Edward Vance felt as if the floor had shifted beneath his feet. The little girl's words echoed in his mind like a deafening alarm. In his 30 years of building a business empire, he had learned to spot lies, manipulations, and power plays. But looking into Isabella's crystal-clear eyes, he saw only pure truth and a child's terror. "Red briefcase," Edward repeated in a low voice, crouching down completely to be at the girl's level. His aides a few feet away began to show impatience, but he ignored them completely. Isabella nodded vigorously, her small hands trembling as she pointed in the direction where she had witnessed the swap. 2 men took out some white papers and put in some yellow ones. They kept looking around like when you do something wrong. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. The briefcase with the red stripe was the exact one containing the primary documentation to be presented to the Russian investors that afternoon. Contracts valued at $2.3 billion, deals that would define the future of his company and thousands of employees. "Can you tell me what these men look like?" Edward asked, keeping his voice calm despite the storm brewing in his mind. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, concentrating. One had a grey mustache and gold glasses. The other one was younger and looked nervous. The one with the mustache put the white papers inside his jacket and put the yellow ones in the briefcase. Every detail Isabella provided strengthened Edward's certainty that he was facing an imminent catastrophe. He knew the man she described perfectly. Viktor Petrov, the Russian consultant hired specifically to validate the international documentation. A man in whom he had placed his complete trust. "Are you sure about what you saw, little one?" Isabella nodded with a seriousness that shouldn't exist in a 5-year-old. "Mommy always says to tell the truth even when it's scary. I was really scared, but now I told you." Edward felt a mix of admiration and urgency. He stood up quickly and discreetly called Robert Davis, his director of security. "Robert, I need you here now." Robert, a 45-year-old former police officer with experience in corporate investigations, approached immediately. Edward pulled him aside and quickly whispered what he had just discovered. "I want you to review the security footage from the last 30 minutes. Look specifically for any suspicious activity involving Viktor Petrov and the meeting documentation." Robert frowned but didn't question it. He had learned to trust Edward's instincts, even when situations seemed improbable. "And the meeting, sir?" "Delay it. Technical difficulties. Make something up. I need 20 minutes to confirm this." As Robert hurried away, Edward turned his attention back to Isabella. The girl was watching him with big, worried eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked in a small voice. Edward knelt again and placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. "You did exactly the right thing. You were very brave." 15 minutes later, Robert returned with a grim expression. He gave Edward a discreet nod, and Edward followed him to a side room where a computer was connected to the security system. "Sir, you're going to want to see this." The security camera footage was crystal clear. Viktor Petrov and his assistant, Dmitry Volkov, were clearly shown doing exactly what Isabella had described. The document swap was captured in detail, including the moment Viktor tucked the original papers inside his suit jacket. Edward felt a cold anger rise in his throat. For months, he had worked on this deal, fully trusting Viktor's expertise and international reputation. The Russian had been recommended by European business partners as an honest and competent consultant. Can you tell what kind of documentation they put in its place? Robert manipulated the controls, zooming in on the image. Although it was impossible to read the content, it was clear that the replacement documents had a completely different appearance and formatting from the originals. From their movements, they looked like altered contracts, probably with modified clauses to benefit third parties, Robert analyzed. Edward clenched his fists. If those fraudulent documents were signed, his company would be legally bound to terms that could include multi-million-dollar transfers, cession of assets, or detrimental agreements disguised as beneficial partnerships. Where are they now? Viktor is in the conference room with the other Russians. Dmitry left the building 10 minutes ago. Edward made a quick decision. Call security. I want Dmitry intercepted before he leaves the building's perimeter, discreetly, and post men at all exits. No one connected to this. Group leaves here until we sort this out. While Robert organized the operation, Edward returned to the hallway where Isabella was still sitting. Carmen had appeared and was talking nervously with her daughter, clearly worried about the interaction between her little girl and the company president. Mrs. Hayes, Edward approached with a reassuring smile. Your daughter just helped me with something very important. May I speak with both of you for a few minutes? Carmen was visibly apprehensive. Her life experiences had taught her that when powerful people wanted to talk, it was rarely a positive thing for people like Hurtin. Mr. Vance, if Isabella did something wrong, I can explain. She wasn't supposed to be here, but I had no one to leave her with, and... Edward gently raised a hand. Carmen, your daughter did nothing wrong. On the contrary, she may have just saved my company from a massive fraud. Carmen looked confusedly between Edward and Isabella, trying to process the information. I don't understand, sir. Edward led the mother and daughter to a smaller meeting room where they could talk privately. Patiently, he explained what Isabella had witnessed and how her observation had uncovered a fraud that could have cost billions. Your daughter has a keen eye for detail and the courage to speak up when something is wrong. Those are rare qualities, even in adults. Carmen looked at Isabella with a mixture of pride and concern. Isabella has always been very observant. Ever since she was little, she's noticed things that go unnoticed. It's a quality that should be nurtured, Edward replied. But now, I need to handle this situation. Carmen, I need you two to stay in this room until I sort everything out. It's for your own protection. Edward's expression had turned serious again. The men involved in this fraud don't know they've been discovered yet, and people who commit crimes of this magnitude can be dangerous when they feel cornered. Carmen held Isabella close, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. What's going to happen now? Edward looked out the room's window where he could see security discreetly positioning themselves in the hallways. Now I'm going to confront Viktor Petrov and find out exactly what he intended to do with my company. Edward Vance walked through the corridors with an icy determination that made employees automatically step out of his way. 30 years, building that empire, facing economic crises, unfair competitors, and political pressure, but he had never felt as betrayed as he did in that moment. In the main conference room, Viktor Petrov sat at the mahogany table, chatting animatedly in Russian with his companions. He wore an expensive grey suit and displayed the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he had complete control of the situation. The briefcase with the red stripe was positioned strategically in front of him, like a trophy. Edward entered the room, followed discreetly by Robert and 2 security guards. The relaxed atmosphere among the Russians changed instantly when they sensed the tension in the air. Victor, Edward said in a low voice, we need to talk, now. Victor smiled, but Edward noticed a flash of nervousness in his eyes. Of course, Edward. We were just discussing the final details of the presentation. Everything is ready for the signing. I'm sure it is. Edward approached the table, his eyes fixed on the red briefcase. In fact, I'd like to review the documents one last time, just to make sure everything is in order. Victor's smile faltered slightly. Edward, you've already reviewed all the documentation multiple times. Our time is limited and the investors are waiting. I insist. Edward held out his hand. The briefcase, please. Victor hesitated for seconds that felt like an eternity. Edward could see the calculation happening in the Russian's mind: comply and be discovered, or refuse and raise suspicion. Of course, Victor finally agreed, pushing the briefcase toward Edward. Edward opened the briefcase and examined the yellowish documents Isabella had seen being placed inside. Even without knowing all the technical details, he immediately identified glaring discrepancies: clauses that weren't in the originals, altered values, and subtle changes in legal language that would transfer. Significant operational control to shell companies registered in tax havens. Victor, Edward slowly raised his eyes, these are not the original documents. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The other Russians at the table began to exchange nervous glances, clearly not expecting this turn of events. What are you implying, Edward? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating that you replaced the original contracts with fraudulent versions. Victor stood up abruptly, his mask of civility finally falling away. This is absurd. You're jeopardizing a billion-dollar deal because of baseless paranoia. Robert, Edward called without taking his eyes. Off, Victor. Show them the footage. Robert placed a tablet on the table, displaying the security camera recordings. Victor and Dmitri were clearly shown executing the document swap. The evidence was irrefutable. The Russian turned pale as he saw the images, but tried to maintain his composure. This is a fabrication. You're trying to frame me to renegotiate the terms of the deal. Victor. Edward stepped closer, his voice carrying an authority that made powerful men tremble. I built this empire on honesty and hard work. I don't need fraudulent schemes to close deals. It was then that Victor made his fatal mistake. Desperate and realizing he was cornered, he tried one last gambit. You don't understand, Edward. This deal is much bigger than you think. There are interests that go beyond your little American company. Edward frowned. What interests? Victor realized too late that he had revealed more than he intended. I was just trying to facilitate the process. Facilitate for whom? Edward pressed. Robert approached and whispered in Edward's ear. Sir, Dmitri tried to flee, but our men intercepted him. He was carrying a briefcase with more documents. Edward nodded and turned his attention back to Victor. I want to know exactly who is behind this, and I want to know now. Victor was visibly sweating, his hands trembling as he tried to think of a way out. Edward, you're making a terrible mistake. There are very powerful people involved in this. People who don't like to be crossed. Threats now, Victor. They're not threats. They're facts. Edward felt a familiar coldness that always washed over him when facing dangerous adversaries. Throughout his career, he had dealt with extortion, industrial espionage, and sabotage attempts. But this felt different, more organized. Robert, Edward said without taking his eyes. Off, Victor. I want you to contact the authorities, and I want all computers and cell phones in this room confiscated. Edward, wait. Victor held up his hands. We can reach an agreement. I can compensate for any inconvenience. The only agreement I'll accept is you telling me the whole truth. Victor looked around the room, realizing he was completely isolated. His Russian companions had distanced themselves from him, clearly not wanting to be associated with the scandal. All right, Victor sighed heavily. But you're not going to like what you hear. Edward crossed his arms and waited. The original deal was real. The investments, the figures, everything was legitimate. But some people, people with a lot of money and influence, found out about the deal and decided they wanted a bigger piece of the pie. What people? A consortium of European investors. They have connections in various multinational corporations and governments. When they learned you were about to close a deal that would make you one of the wealthiest men in the country, they decided it wasn't in their best interest. Edward felt a shiver. The scale of what Victor was revealing was much larger than he had imagined. So, you were sent to sabotage my company. Not sabotage, control. The altered documents would transfer 60% of operational control to companies controlled by the consortium. You would remain as president, but all major decisions would go through them. Edward clenched his fists. Decades of work had almost been destroyed by external greed. And if I had discovered the fraud after signing? Victor gave a bitter smile. Then it would have been too late. The contracts are legally binding, and the consortium has very competent lawyers. Robert approached Edward again. Sir, we found something in Dimitri's briefcase. It seems there's more than one company being targeted in this operation. Your company was just the first on a list. Edward felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just an attack on Vance Enterprises. It was a coordinated operation to take control of multiple American companies. How many companies are on the list? Victor hesitated before answering. 23. The silence that followed Victor's revelation was deafening. 23 companies. Edward felt as if the floor had vanished from under his feet. What had started as a targeted attack on his company was in fact a systematic operation to dominate entire sectors of the American economy. I need to see that list, Edward said in a voice he didn't recognize as his own. Robert handed him the briefcase that had been confiscated from Dimitri. Edward opened it with hands he tried to keep steady. The contents were devastating. Organized folders with detailed information on each target company, including financial analyses, operational weaknesses, and specific infiltration strategies. As Edward read the names, his horror intensified. There were some of the biggest companies in the country. Construction firms, media groups, tech companies, regional banks. Each one represented thousands of jobs and billions in economic activity. How long have you been planning this? Edward asked, his voice laced with a dangerous coldness. Victor, realizing there was no longer any point in hiding the truth, answered with resignation. 18 months. The first phase was reconnaissance and infiltration. We identified the most vulnerable companies and began placing our consultants in positions of trust. Edward felt nauseous. For a year and a half, while he had been working tirelessly to expand his company, he had been watched, analyzed, and set up for destruction. How many of you are spread across the country? I don't know the exact number. The operation is compartmentalized. Each team only knows its own target. Robert approached Edward again, whispering, Sir, we found something more disturbing. There's evidence they've already successfully infiltrated at least 5 companies on the list. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of the situation. 5 companies had already fallen. Hundreds of other people like him, honest entrepreneurs who had dedicated their lives to building something, were now under the control of external forces without even knowing it. Which companies? Edward asked, dreading the answer. Robert consulted his notes. Miller Construction Group, South Tech Systems, Northeast Regional Bank, Coal, Industries and Midwest Media Group. Edward personally knew the owners of all those companies. Anthony Miller had been his golf partner for 15 years. Teresa Cole had been his college classmate. The thought of them being manipulated without their knowledge made his stomach turn. I have to warn them, Edward murmured. Edward, Victor interrupted, you don't understand the complexity of this. If you try to interfere with the other operations, you'll put your own life at risk. Are you threatening me again? I'm trying to warn you, the consortium didn't invest millions of dollars in this operation to let one American businessman destroy it. Edward looked around the room, observing the tense faces of everyone present. The reality of the situation was crystallizing. He wasn't just dealing with opportunistic fraudsters. He was facing an international organization with enough resources and influence to execute coordinated operations on a national scale. Robert, Edward said, I want you to immediately contact the security directors of all the companies on this list. Warn them about the infiltration. Sir, it might be prudent to contact federal authorities first. This is beyond what we can handle internally. Edward hesitated. Involving government authorities in an operation of this magnitude could have unforeseen consequences. Information leaks, political interference, or worse, discovering that the government itself had been infiltrated. Not yet, Edward decided. First, We'll warn the companies directly. We need to know the true extent of the problem before we escalate. Just then, his phone rang. The screen showed Anthony Miller's name. Edward felt a chill run down his spine as he answered the call. "Edward," Anthony's voice sounded desperate, "I need to talk to you urgently. Something terrible is happening at my company." Edward exchanged a tense look with Robert. "What's wrong, Anthony?" "I found out my international consultants altered fundamental contracts. I've lost operational control of 70% of the company without even realizing it. Edward, they've stolen my life's work." Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility grow exponentially. "Anthony, where are you now?" "At home, but Edward, there have been strange men watching my house since yesterday. I'm scared." The call was abruptly disconnected. Edward tried calling back, but Anthony's phone was off. "Robert, send a team to Anthony Miller's house, now." Victor, who had overheard part of the conversation, shook his head grimly. "It's already started. When people try to resist, the consortium takes measures to ensure silence." Edward felt a cold anger build in his chest. "What kind of measures?" "Intimidation first. If that doesn't work..." Victor left the sentence hanging. "Finish the sentence, Victor." "They make people disappear, not permanently," Victor hurried to clarify, "but temporarily, long enough to consolidate control and make any resistance irrelevant." Edward understood he was dealing with something far more dangerous than corporate fraud. It was a systematic hostile takeover operation with elements of physical intimidation. "Robert, I want 24-hour security for my family, and I want protection for Carmen and Isabella too." "Isabella?" Victor looked confused. Edward smiled coldly. "The girl who destroyed your plans. The janitor's daughter who was paying attention when powerful adults were too distracted to notice they were being betrayed." Victor paled as he understood the implication. "A child uncovered our operation? A 5-year-old child watched you swap documents and had the courage to tell me. While you were underestimating the intelligence of Americans, you were discovered by a little girl who hasn't even learned to read properly yet." The humiliation on Victor's face was evident. Months of meticulous planning had been destroyed by the innocent observation of a child. Edward walked to the window, watching the city bustle below. Millions of people going about their normal lives, unaware that their jobs and futures were under attack by forces they couldn't even imagine. His phone rang again. This time it was Teresa Cole. "Edward, thank God you answered. I'm desperate." "Teresa, what's happening?" "My company..." "Edward, I found out I signed contracts that effectively transferred control to a shell company. How is that possible? I always review everything myself." Edward glanced at Victor, who looked down in shame. "Teresa, are you safe?" "For now, yes, but Edward, they're demanding I sign more documents today. They say if I don't, they'll trigger clauses that will leave me in financial ruin." Edward clenched his fists. The operation wasn't just about corporate control. It was about the complete destruction of any resistance. "Teresa, don't sign anything. I'm sending help." "Edward, how do you know about this?" Edward looked at Victor, who was watching the conversation with a defeated expression. "Because it almost happened to me, too. But I got lucky. A very special child saved me." Edward hung up the phone and turned to Robert with a determination that made the security director instinctively straighten his posture. "I want you to organize a coordinated operation. We need to alert all the companies on the list simultaneously before the consortium realizes they've been discovered." Robert nodded, but his expression revealed concern. "Sir, an operation of this magnitude could attract unwanted attention. If the consortium has the resources to infiltrate 23 companies, they probably have contacts who can interfere with our efforts." Edward paused for a moment, considering Robert's words. He was right. A direct approach could alert the enemy and put more lives at risk. "You're right," Edward admitted. "We need to be more strategic." Just then, a discreet knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Robert opened it and Carmen appeared, holding Isabella by the hand. The girl was carrying a colorful drawing she had made while waiting. "Mr. Vance," Carmen said hesitantly, "Isabella wanted to give this to you." Edward bent down to receive the drawing. It was a simple but touching portrait. A little girl and a man in a suit standing side by side, with a big yellow sun shining above them. At the bottom, in crooked letters that Carmen had clearly helped her write, it said, "Thank you for believing me." Edward felt a lump in his throat. Amidst all the complexity and danger he was facing, this child had managed to see something simple and pure: gratitude. "Isabella," Edward said softly, "can I ask you a question?" The girl nodded shyly. "When you saw those men switching the papers, what did you feel?" Isabella thought for a moment, her small forehead wrinkled in concentration. "I felt like they were doing something really bad, like when someone takes another person's toy and pretends it's theirs." The simplicity of the answer hit Edward like a lightning bolt. Isabella had captured the essence of what the consortium was doing, theft disguised as legitimate business. "Isabella," Edward continued, "do you think other people should know when someone is doing bad things?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Mommy always says that when you see someone getting hurt, you have to help." Edward looked at Carmen, who was watching the conversation with curiosity and apprehension. "Carmen, your daughter just gave me the answer I needed." Edward stood up and turned to Robert. "We're changing the strategy. Instead of a large, coordinated operation, we'll do this person by person. We'll go to the business owners, individually as concerned friends, not as investigators." Robert frowned. "That will take much more time, sir. But it will be less detectable. And," Edward glanced at Isabella, "we'll bring our secret weapon." Carmen looked alarmed. "Mr. Vance, I don't understand." Edward smiled reassuringly. "Carmen, your daughter has a gift for sensing when something is wrong. If we take her to visit these companies, she might be able to identify other infiltrators who might not be obvious." Carmen hugged Isabella protectively. "Sir, with all due respect, my daughter has already done her part. I don't want to put her in any more danger." Edward perfectly understood Carmen's concern. "You're right. Isabella has already done more than any adult could ask. But Carmen, think of the other children whose parents could lose everything if we don't stop this." Carmen looked at Isabella, who was listening to the conversation with an attention impressive for her age. "Mommy," Isabella said in a small but determined voice, "if I can help other people like the mister helped us, I want to help." Carmen felt tears well up in her eyes. Her daughter, at 5 years old, was showing a courage and sense of justice that many adults lacked. "Will she be safe?" Carmen asked. Edward nodded firmly. "I'll have a discreet security team with us at all times, and Isabella won't be exposed to any dangerous situations. She'll just observe while we talk to the business owners." 2 hours later, Edward, Isabella, Carmen, and a small security team, dressed as regular executives, arrived at Teresa Cole's office. Edward had called ahead, explaining that he wanted to discuss an urgent matter of corporate security. The Cole Industries building was modest compared to Vance Enterprises, but well organized. Teresa received them in her office with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. "Edward, thank you for coming. I'm still trying to understand how I was fooled so easily." Edward introduced Carmen and Isabella as special consultants in irregularity detection. Teresa looked confused, but didn't question it. "Teresa, I need you to introduce me to the international consultants who are working with you." Teresa hesitated. "They're in an important meeting right now. They said they didn't want to be disturbed." Edward and Isabella exchanged glances. The behavior was identical to what they had witnessed with Victor. "Teresa, where exactly are they meeting?" "In the 10th floor conference room." Edward turned to Isabella. "Isabella, would you like to take a walk around the office while the grown-ups talk?" Isabella nodded, and, accompanied discreetly by Carmen and a security guard, left the room. 15 minutes later, Isabella returned with a serious expression that Edward was already learning to recognize. "Mr. Edward," she whispered, "there are some men on the 10th floor who are messing with papers just like the other ones." Edward felt his blood run cold. "Are you sure?" Isabella nodded. "They have the same kind of briefcases and they're switching papers, and there's a man who looks like the one with the grey mustache, but this one has a beard." Edward looked at Teresa, who had overheard the conversation. "Teresa, how many consultants are working here?" 3. They were recommended by the same firm that recommended yours." Edward understood that the consortium had used the same infiltration strategy on multiple companies, seemingly independent recommendations that actually came from the same source. "Teresa, I need you to come with me to the 10th floor. Now." "Edward, they specifically said they didn't want to be disturbed." "Teresa," Edward placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Trust me, your company is being stolen from you at this very moment." Teresa paled but nodded. The group headed to the 10th floor, using the executive elevator to avoid alerting the consultants. When they reached the conference room, Edward instructed Teresa to open the door normally, as if it were a routine visit. What they found confirmed Edward's worst fears. 3 men were hunched over a table full of documents, executing the exact same type of operation Victor had attempted: open briefcases, papers being replaced, and an urgency that revealed they knew they were racing against time. When they saw Teresa enter, accompanied, the 3 men froze. "Teresa," one of them said with a European accent, "we explained that we needed privacy." "Alexei," Teresa replied, her voice trembling with rising anger, "what are you doing with my documents?" Edward stepped forward. "They're doing exactly what your colleague Victor tried to do to me yesterday. They're replacing your legitimate contracts with fraudulent versions that transfer control of your company." Alexei looked at Edward with recognition. "Edward Vance. Victor informed us of your impediment yesterday." Edward smiled coldly. "So you know the operation has been discovered." "We know there was a setback, but that won't stop the overall timeline." It was then that Isabella, who had been quiet until that moment, pointed to one of the briefcases on the table. "Mommy, that's just like the briefcase the other men were messing with." Alexei looked at Isabella as if seeing her for the first time. "Who is this child?" Edward smiled. "This is Isabella, the girl who destroyed your plans." The revelation that Isabella had unmasked the entire operation left Alexei visibly shaken. He stared at the girl as if he were seeing a ghost, unable to process that months of sophisticated planning had been destroyed by the innocent observation of a child. "Impossible," Alexei muttered. "A child couldn't possibly comprehend the complexity of our operation." Edward approached the table where the documents were spread out. "You underestimated something fundamental: honesty. Isabella didn't need to understand contracts or clauses. She just knew how to recognize when someone was doing something wrong." Teresa, who had been watching in shock, finally found her voice. "Alexei, how many of my contracts have you altered?" Alexei exchanged nervous glances with his companions. "Teresa, you don't understand the implications of what you're asking." "Answer the question," Edward intervened with authority. 60% of the primary contracts," Alexei admitted reluctantly. "But Teresa, this was done to protect your long-term interests. Protect them by stealing my company." Edward examined the documents on the table. The sophistication of the operation was impressive. The fraudsters hadn't just altered contracts. They had created a complex legal structure that would make it nearly impossible to reverse the changes through traditional legal means. "Robert," Edward called through his intercom, "I need you on the 10th floor immediately." While they waited, Isabella approached Edward and gently tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Edward," she whispered, "there's something strange." Edward bent down to be at the girl's level. "What did you notice, Isabella?" "That man over there." She pointed discreetly to the third conspirator, who had remained silent. "He doesn't seem like the others." Edward observed the man Isabella had indicated. Unlike Alexei and his partner, who looked visibly nervous, this one remained calm, almost calculating. "Why do you think he's different?" "He's not scared like the others. He's thinking." Isabella's observation made Edward examine the man more closely. There was something in his posture, a confidence that contrasted with Alexei's growing desperation. It was then that the third man smiled. "The girl is very perceptive," he said in an accent Edward couldn't immediately place. "My name is Marcus Webb, and you've all just made a very serious mistake." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. "What mistake?" Marcus stood up calmly and walked to the window. You think this is just an operation by a few opportunistic fraudsters. You don't comprehend that you're interfering with something much bigger. Explain yourself. Marcus smiled again, this time with a coldness that made Carmen instinctively pull Isabella closer. Edward, do you really believe that a consortium with the resources to infiltrate 23 companies simultaneously wouldn't have contingency plans? Edward exchanged worried glances with Teresa. What kind of contingency plans? Since last night, when Victor informed us of your discovery, we activated the emergency protocol. Right now, all the remaining companies on the list are being forced to sign emergency documentation. Edward felt his blood run cold. Forced how? Persuasive methods. When billions of dollars are at stake, Edward, subtlety becomes an unnecessary luxury. Robert arrived at that moment, accompanied by 2 security guards. His expression was grim. Sir, we have a problem. We've received emergency calls from 4 business owners on our list. They're all reporting similar situations, extreme pressure to sign documents immediately, with threats of severe consequences if they refuse. Edward clenched his fists. What kind of threats? Financial blackmail, fabricated legal threats, and... Robert hesitated, glancing at Isabella. Personal threats. Carmen hugged Isabella tightly, finally understanding the true gravity of the situation they had stumbled into. Marcus observed the group's reaction with evident satisfaction. Now, you're beginning to understand. This is not an operation that can be stopped by a few lucky discoveries. Edward approached Marcus with a dangerous determination. If you touch any of those families, I guarantee you will face consequences. Your consortium can't imagine. Marcus laughed. Edward, you're an American businessman. As successful as you are, you don't have the resources or connections to take on an international organization of this level. It was then that Isabella did something unexpected. She gently freed herself from Carmen's arms and walked up to Marcus. Mister, she said in her small but clear voice, you're being very mean. Marcus looked down, visibly annoyed at having his intimidation interrupted by a child. Little girl, go back to your mother. No, Isabella replied with surprising firmness. My mommy taught me that when big people are mean to little people, someone has to do something. Edward watched Isabella with growing admiration. The girl, without fully understanding the complexity of the situation, had identified the heart of the problem. Abuse of power. Isabella, Edward said softly, what do you think we should do? Isabella thought for a moment, her small forehead wrinkled in concentration. We have to tell everyone what they're doing, so that all the people will know and can protect themselves. Marcus laughed dismissively. And who's going to believe you, a desperate businessman and a janitor with her daughter against a respected international consortium? Isabella looked at Marcus with a seriousness that was impressive for her age. People will believe it because it's the truth. And when you tell the truth, other people who are good will help you. Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Isabella had just perfectly articulated the strategy they needed. Full transparency. Robert, Edward said, a new determination in his voice, I want you to contact every major business publication in the country. We're taking this operation public. Marcus suddenly looked less confident. Edward, you don't understand the ramifications of making this public. There are very powerful people involved who do not tolerate exposure. Then they should have thought of that before they tried to rob American companies. Teresa, who had been watching the exchange in silence, finally spoke up. Edward's right. If we're going to fight this, we need to do it out in the open. Robert pulled Edward to the corner of the room. Sir, I have more disturbing information. We've discovered the consortium has connections to some influential political figures. Going public could trigger retaliation on multiple levels. Edward looked at Isabella, who was explaining something to Carmen in a low voice, her small hands gesturing animatedly. Robert, that 5-year-old girl had the courage to stand up to powerful men to protect people she doesn't even know. How can I have less courage than her? At that moment, Edward's phone rang. The screen showed Anthony Miller's number. Edward, Anthony's voice was desperate, they took my daughter. Edward felt the world stop. What do you mean they took her? Men showed up at her school. They said it was a family emergency and that I had authorized it. The school let them take Mariana. Edward looked at Marcus, who was smiling with malicious satisfaction. Where is she, Anthony? I don't know. They called 10 minutes ago and said she's safe, but if I don't sign the documents by 6 o'clock this evening, I won't see her again. Edward ended the call and turned to Marcus with a controlled fury that made the man instinctively back away. You kidnapped a child. We ensured cooperation through effective methods, Marcus replied, trying to maintain his arrogance. Edward looked at Isabella, whose wide eyes showed she understood that something terrible was happening. Isabella, Edward said gently, do you still think we should tell everyone about these bad men? Isabella nodded vigorously. Even more now, they hurt a kid like me. Edward's decision was instant and irrevocable. The kidnapping of an innocent child had crossed a line that turned his fight from a business matter to a personal one. He turned to Robert with a determination that made the security director automatically stand straighter. Robert, I want you to contact every media outlet in the country. Newspapers, television, radio, social media. We are going to expose this entire operation. Marcus tried to hold on to his arrogance, but Edward could see the cracks in his confidence. Edward, you're making a mistake that will cost you far more than your company. There are forces involved here that can destroy your life in ways you can't even imagine. Edward stepped up to Marcus until they were face to face. They've already destroyed the lives of innocent people. Now it's my turn to destroy theirs. Isabella, who had watched the rising tension, tugged on Edward's sleeve again. Mr. Edward, she whispered, I remember something important. Edward bent down to listen to her. When I saw the men switching the papers, one of them said a strange word on the phone. I remembered it, because I thought it sounded pretty. What word, Isabella? Zvezdopad. He said the Zvezdopad would start today. Edward frowned, not recognizing the word, but Marcus turned deathly pale. How did you hear that word? Marcus demanded, his arrogance instantly evaporating. Isabella looked at him innocently. The man said it on the phone. He said the Zvezdopad was going to start at 6 o'clock. Edward looked between Isabella and Marcus, realizing the girl had inadvertently uncovered something crucial. What does Zvezdopad mean, Marcus? Marcus hesitated, clearly debating internally how much to reveal. It's the code name for the final phase of the operation. What final phase? Robert approached quickly, checking his phone. Sir, I'm getting alarming intel. At 6 o'clock simultaneously, all the companies on the list are being forced to transfer assets immediately. It's no longer about future control, it's about immediate liquidation of resources. Edward felt as if he'd been struck by lightning. The true scope of the consortium's plan was finally revealed. They don't want to control the companies, Edward murmured. They want to drain all their resources and disappear. Marcus, realizing the game was up, finally admitted the truth. Zvezdopad means meteor shower in Russian. It's the total extraction operation. In 6 hours, all liquid assets from the infiltrated companies will be transferred to offshore accounts, and the operation will be terminated. Teresa grabbed Edward's arm. Edward, does that mean they're going to completely destroy all these companies? Worse than that, Marcus continued with shocking coldness. It means tens of thousands of employees will lose their jobs, and the business owners will be left with massive debts from the transfers. Carmen, who had listened to the entire conversation in growing horror, hugged Isabella tightly. That's so many people's jobs, so many families. Edward looked at Isabella, whose expression showed that even at 5, she understood that something terrible was about to happen to a lot of people. Mr. Edward, Isabella said in a small but determined voice, we have to stop them. Edward nodded, a new resolve crystallizing in his mind. Robert, change of plans. We're not just going to expose the operation. We're going to stop it. How, sir? Edward looked at Marcus. You're going to give us access to the consortium's communication systems. Marcus laughed dismissively. And why would I do that? Because, Edward smiled coldly, Isabella just gave me the information. I need to negotiate with your superiors. Edward took out his phone and dialed a number he had memorized from Victor's documents. Hello, a voice with a Russian accent answered. This is Edward Vance. I need to speak with the leader of Operation Zvezdopad. There was a tense silence on the other end of the line. How did you learn that code name? Edward looked at Isabella, who was watching him with complete confidence. From a very special source, and I have a proposal you're going to want to hear. 20 minutes later, a video conference was established in the meeting room. On the screen appeared a middle-aged man, impeccably dressed, sitting in an office that had clearly cost millions to decorate. Mr. Vance, the man spoke in English with a Russian accent, I am Dmitry Kozlov, coordinator of the project you have uncovered. I understand you wish to negotiate. Edward took a deep breath. Dmitry, I'll be direct. In 1 hour, I will make your entire operation public. Names, infiltrated companies, methods, everything. This will not only destroy your plans in the United States, but it will expose you internationally. Dmitry laughed. And what does that gain you? We simply activate the final phase immediately and leave the country. Ah, Edward smiled. But you can't do that. Why not? Edward looked at Isabella, who nodded encouragingly. Because a 5-year-old child overheard your operators mention that Operation Zvezdopad requires specific authorization codes that can only be entered in sequence during the 6 hours before the final transfer. Dmitry paled slightly. And, Edward continued, we also know that these codes are unique to each company and are stored on the tablets your operators carry. Robert whispered in Edward's ear. Sir, we managed to intercept 3 of those tablets when we detained the teams. Here and at Teresa's company. Edward smiled at the camera. Dmitry, without those codes, you can't complete the transfers, and now we have access to them. Dmitry was silent for a long moment. What do you want, Vance? I want all the kidnapped children released immediately. I want all fraudulent contracts voided, and I want you out of the United States permanently. And in return... Edward looked at Isabella one more time. The girl, understanding she was witnessing a crucial moment, nodded encouragingly. In return, you leave the country without international exposure. You maintain your reputations elsewhere. Dmitry considered the proposal for several tense minutes. I accept your terms, but I want the codes back. The codes will be destroyed upon confirmation that all your conditions have been met. 2 hours later, Robert confirmed that Mariana Miller had been released at the school where she was taken. Anthony called in tears, thanking Edward endlessly. One by one, the other victims of the consortium were contacted and informed that the fraudulent contracts would be voided and that they would receive legal documentation confirming the full restoration of control over their companies. That night, Edward sat in his office with Isabella and Carmen. The building was finally quiet after the most intense day of his business career. Isabella, Edward said softly, you saved more than 20 companies and thousands of jobs today. Isabella swung her little legs in the big chair. I just told the truth like Mummy taught me. Edward looked at Carmen. Carmen, your daughter taught me something fundamental. For years I focused on building an empire, but I forgot that an empire without values is just a house of cards. Carmen smiled shyly. Mr. Vance, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us. Edward shook his head. Carmen, you're the ones who did something for me. Isabella reminded me of what really matters. Edward stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the illuminated city below. Carmen, I have a proposal for you. Yes, sir. I want to create a new department in the company, Corporate Observation and Integrity. It would be responsible for identifying irregularities and protecting the company from future fraud. Carmen looked confused. And I'd like you to be the director of that department. Carmen's eyes widened. Mr. Vance, I'm a janitor. I don't have the formal education for a position like that. Edward smiled. Carmen, you raised a daughter who had the courage to stand up to international criminals to protect people she didn't even know. That tells me everything I need to know about your integrity and values. Isabella jumped out of her chair and ran to hug Edward. Does that mean Mommy gets to work in the nice office now? Edward laughed, feeling true joy for the first time in days. It means your mommy is going to help protect a lot of other people, just like you two protected me. Carmen had tears in her eyes. "Mr. Vance, Edward, call me Edward." "Edward, I accept, but on one condition." "What's that?" Carmen looked at Isabella with immense pride. "I want Isabella to be our honorary consultant. She has a gift for seeing things that adults miss." Edward extended his hand to Isabella. "Isabella Hayes, do you accept the position of Chief Special Observation Consultant?" Isabella shook Edward's hand solemnly. "I accept, but only if I can keep telling the truth always." Edward laughed, feeling as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Isabella, I hope you never stop telling the truth." 3 months later, the Corporate Observation and Integrity Department had already identified and prevented 2 minor fraud attempts. Carmen had completed accelerated courses in business management, and Isabella continued to make occasional visits to the office, always observing attentively and occasionally pointing out things the adults had missed. The story of the girl who saved billions became a legend in the American business world, but for Edward, Carmen, and Isabella, it was simply the beginning of a friendship and partnership that would forever change the way they did business. The truth, as Isabella had always known, really did have the power to change everything.